Brilliant. Okay, well, thanks everybody for joining online. We've got 34 of you, 35 of you, and more joining as we start. So welcome everybody to this CDI webinar on ethics and evaluation, current debates and practice. We're in hybrid mode. So that means we've got people online and we've got those of you online. You can't see everybody else in the room because of the way the camera's set, but we've got a nice turnout in the room as well. So thanks all for coming on a Friday afternoon. My name is Marina Apka and I'm a research fellow here at IDS. And my work focuses largely on equity-oriented and participatory evaluation. So ethics is very central to what I do and think about, which is why I'm really happy to be able to have this conversation with everyone today, and I'll be chairing the session. And this is really another step in quite a long journey of the Centre for Development Impact talking about ethics and evaluation. And for those of you who aren't familiar with CDI, it's a collaboration between IDS, our colleagues at ITAD, and colleagues at the University of East Anglia. And essentially, it's a collaboration that looks at innovation and impact evaluation. A lot of our focus is on methodologies, but we also have broader conversations such as these around ethics. And actually, I think it was in 2015 that CDI undertook a review of ethical guidance in evaluation. And our speakers today know much more about that because they were around in those days. So that was before my time at IDS. And in 2016, there was in fact a seminar. I don't know if it was in this room, but maybe.
It was in this room.
It was in this room. There we go. Which was at the time looking at this question of how do we deal with ethics in evaluation. And at that time, the conversation was newer than it is now. And the reviews were suggesting that there's this very fragmented ecosystem of guidance emerging, and that actually often it was missing, or conversations about ethics were often quite silent in the evaluation world, right? And at the time, there was a sort of emphasis on needing to move from guidelines into more embodied practice. Yeah? So we're here now 6 or 7 or so years later, and we're returning to this question because it's ever more important, right? It's becoming more and more central to our discussions in evaluation, but also more broadly in international development. And we're all familiar with some of the shifts that we see in those conversations, for example, around how we engage with or shift power in and through evaluation, and debates around social justice, equity, etc. And for example, the American Evaluation Conference, which is happening in a few weeks' time, there's been a series of town halls and conversations leading up to that on precisely these sorts of issues. And some of what's coming out of those discussions, and I think there's a few people online who may be more involved in them. So when we come to the discussion portion, please do chip in with your experience of those. But essentially, some of the things coming up are that while we acknowledge it's really important to think about ethics in evaluation, there's still quite a lot of inertia, right? So things aren't necessarily moving as quickly as we might have hoped. And also some warning signs that, particularly in a moment when we're talking about decolonising development, there's a vibrant debate right here in IDS as well, these conversations and processes aren't without their tensions and their complications. So we're really happy that today, and we're actually really privileged to have our 3 speakers with us today. So 2 of the editors and a contributing author of this new book on ethics for evaluation, Beyond Doing No Harm to Tackling Bad and Doing Good. So I'll introduce our speakers in a couple of minutes. But I just wanted to say that as I was reading through the book, which is quite large, 12 chapters, and lots of diversity in them, what I appreciated a couple of things. The first was that the framing for evaluation is very much embracing a moment where we think about evaluation not simply as a technical endeavor, but we're also acknowledging that it's part of broader decision-making processes, we're acknowledging complexity. And that's really helpful, I think, as a starting point for a conversation on ethics. The other thing that I really appreciated was that you bring forward in the book very much a conversation about ethics as a process. Yeah. So again, picking up on this idea of moving beyond guidelines, actually thinking about practice. And what I think the book does really well is that it starts to bring to life what that practice looks like, because there really aren't many examples of cases of what does an ethical conundrum or dilemma look like, and how do I navigate that as an evaluator, as a commissioner, right? And that, so the book really looks across those spaces. So it's really exciting that we now get to hear from the editors and authors of the book a little bit more about really how the book came about, some of the frameworks that you include in it, and what you think is it brings to this conversation about ethics in evaluation today. So what we'll do is I'll introduce our speakers, then I'll hand over to them, and we're going to hear from each of them, and then we'll come into a discussion session. Those of you online, please do put ideas, questions, anything you want to contribute into the chat. My colleague Hill is going to be manning the chat for us, and we'll come to you for your questions first. So, to the speakers. First, we have Rob van der Berg, who's an honorary associate here at IDS for how many years?
Just a few years.
Before
that, I was a visiting fellow.
Okay.
And then at a certain moment, they decided that the visit was long overdue.
You know the same the visit, therefore, yeah.
Yes.
And he's also a visiting professor at King's College, and Rob's been involved in our discussions with CDI and in many ways over the years. He was recently president of IDEAS, and he also was the director of the Independent Evaluation Office of the Global Environment Facility, and also the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So a long career, lots of great experience in thinking about these issues over there. Next, we have Penny Hawkins, who's here from New Zealand. Actually, she's based in New Zealand, so we're thrilled that you were actually able to come and be here in person. Who's an evaluation specialist that's working independently since, I think, 2016. Yeah. But that was after a very long career in evaluation leadership roles in government, but also with philanthropy. And that included a stint as head of evaluation at the Department for International Development, as it was known then, DFID, and was also former chair of the OECD DAC network on development evaluation and many other roles. So thank you, Penny, for being with us. And then we have Chris Barnett, who actually was, I think, part of the founding team of the Center for Development Impact. So also a long history. Also an honorary associate here at IPS and a partner at ITAD, where he leads high-profile, large, fascinating evaluations and has a particular interest in power imbalances and how to assess social impact of private and blended interventions. So welcome. Thanks so much for being here. I will hand over to you now for your presentations.
Okay.
Can everybody on the Zoom call hear us okay? Just to make sure. Yes, brilliant.
So I can use this to go through the, okay. Well, I'm very happy to be here and to follow up indeed what we started at CDI. At CDI, Temlin Munslow worked on building up a database on guidelines for evaluation. And that's what I've used as a kind of a building stone for the second chapter of this book. So work of CDI also has played an important role in this book. But first, let us discuss the case for ethics. And basically, the reaction that we used to get when we raised the issue of ethics was, who cares about ethics? We don't. And it's something that's being discussed at universities. So it's proper that universities take care of this, but it's not something for ordinary people. Yet the public arena, more than ever, is full of ethical denouncements, basically saying Trump is a crook, Truss is a total failure, blah, blah, blah. These are all ethical terms. They are not terms of competency or of professionalism. They are ethical judgments from both sides. So it's not just Trump, of course, will say that all the Democrats are crooked and total, and they need to be locked up. So there is a kind of a contradiction in this. On the one hand, ethics, we don't care about ethics. On the other hand, the public arena is full of ethics. Now, what do evaluators think about ethics? We've seen several surveys throughout the years, which basically tell us again and again that about a third of evaluators feel that ethics is not applicable to evaluation. Evaluation is just kind of a truth-gathering exercise where neutral and objective scientists gather information on what's happening, and they bring this together in a report. And then we have another third of evaluators who say, no, yes, ethical considerations are important, but personally, I've never ever had anything to do with that. So, and I don't see that in my future career, I will actually have ethical considerations because it's not really applicable to my kind of evaluation. And then there's a third of evaluators who see the relevance of ethics for their practices and are interested and will engage on ethics. But that doesn't mean that all of them are in agreement on what that actually means. So the reviews that we've had in 2006, 2014, 16, and in 2019 conclude that ethics guidance in evaluations is fragmented and scattered. So it's okay to think that in 2006, yes, of course, that was a new subject. But in 2019, we come up with the same conclusion. And we again conclude that we are not talking the same language, that evaluators can talk about ethics in totally different terms and totally different perspectives on how this should be incorporated. And then we also found there was hardly any information about how ethics was applied in actual practice. So evaluators would not report back. They encountered ethical issues in their work and they would solve them somehow, but they would not report back on how this was done. Now, the book then emerged from, indeed, Penny was also present at the meeting here at IDS in 2016. And we felt this was an important subject. And we are members of another group of authors, the so-called interval group, that produces these books. So Penny and I, at a certain moment, raised the issue, we need to have a book about ethics. And the one-third division became clear in the interval group as well. One-third basically said ethics is not relevant for our work. And basically said, one of them said, if any of my staff would have said that he had ethical considerations, I would have fired him or her immediately. Because that actually meant that they wouldn't accept the authority of the boss. So this division was visible there as well. But together with Nicoletta Stame, the three of us managed to get this book off the ground. And our aim was then to look at the framework, common terminology, and see whether we could contribute to the cases on ethical issues. And I think we've succeeded in principle on all three of these accounts. We bring a lot of cases to the reader. We discuss common terminology. And so in potential, this is a book that you can build on. On the framework that we choose for the book, we first went back to Michael Scriven, to his division for a small area of ethics and a large area of ethics. The small area of ethics in Michael's perspective was the professional ethics. Ethics that we adopt in the way that we do our work. But the vast area was really, what are the implications for society? And there were two ways in which we would interact with society, as evaluators, but also in our evaluations. So this is then the framework that we developed for the book. And we further thought about this through recognition of Des Gasper's differentiation between planned versus unplanned suffering in development, which is basically saying planned suffering is if something bad is happening. The government is suppressing a group of people or a region in the country, and it's planned. And it's usually people look away from this and say, oh, we're going to work in this country, and we know that in that region there are all kinds of issues, but we won't really bother about that. We'll have a look at how we can do our work as well as possible. And that led us, thinking this through, that led us to identify that in ethics you can recognize that you need to do your work as best as you can, but also potentially you can do something about the evil that is happening in the world, and you can do something about potential good. And those are the windows that open up the debates. Now, just a quick look at the ethics guidance. The yellow, the blue line is the number of national associations for evaluation that were coming up in the world. But ethics guidance is remaining very low in comparison. And again, underscoring that this is difficult to discuss in our profession. So in the first instance, when ethical guidance started up around 2000, 2006, the focus used to be completely on doing no harm. And this came from a focus on professionalism. We are professionals, we are objective scientists, so we just need to be sure that in our research design, we do not harm people. That's sufficient. And then the outcome of the evaluation will be objective and neutral and independent and so on. Now, in order to start looking at tackling bad and doing good, the potential for that, you need to broaden your perspective. You need to look at what the possibilities are. And while the book focuses on what evaluation should do, please note that the guidance on bad and good that has now emerged is still less than 10% of all guidance. So it's not as if the profession basically said, oh, we're now, from now on, we'll be tackling bad in the world and we're doing good. It's just a small portion of guidance still. The main guidance continues to be professionalization. Although these interests and values that decide whether we pay attention to possibilities, to bad situations and to good situations, are now the most important in the guidance. And professionalization is now second place. Because if we go back 20 years, it was only professionalism, and interests and values were not even there. So this is very interesting to see happening, but it's still not sufficient, because we could basically divide out what of this would actually involve tackling bad and doing good, and what of this was doing no harm. And you see that doing no harm still dominates and is still the most important category. So the book contains then 20 practical cases on how ethics has been encountered in concrete situations, spread over 4 chapters. Not all chapters have these cases, but at least one of Shekhar Singh has a huge number of cases. So very interesting read. The country perspective is also very visible in several chapters. Each country is unique, has its own specific context, has its own religion, its own background, its own traditional knowledge, and so on. And it should play a strong role in further work on this. Complexity and resilience were dealt with in 2 other chapters. You will hear from Chris on his experience. And there was a transformative lens in several of the chapters, and decolonisation and the indigenous perspective are coming up in the chapter of Ophir and Gallagher. And of course, as editors, we wrote the final chapter where we basically present a way forward. And the way forward is that we need to agree on terminology and guidance. We don't say that there should be global guidance. We just say that we need to be able to talk about it. At the moment, we're not able to talk about it because the terminology differs per guidance. And so they're all talking in different tongues. We are a Tower of Babel, so to say, rather than at the moment a good forum to discuss ethical issues. And successful global ethical guidance exists. UNEC, IDEAS, IOCE, they have worked on this, and they have produced guidance that was agreed throughout the world. But the terminology differs between these. So if the world can agree on Agenda 2030 and on action against climate change, evaluators ought to be able to agree on inclusive terminology and ethics guidance that would be at the heart of a global exercise in professionalization of ethical evaluation practice. So that's our final hope, that this will be the future of the work in this regard. And the last slide is basically to remind us that there are many global sustainability crises happening at the moment that all require us as evaluators to think broader in terms of how can we tackle the bad that is happening here? How can we support the good that is actually reversing this harm? And it can be achieved if we, as evaluators, provide insight into the context of the interventions and the policies that we need to evaluate. So context analysis is what we propose. And I'm sure this will be shared, so you have the reference to the book.
Great, thanks very much. I think we'll go straight on to Chris, if that's okay. We'll take questions at the end.
Thank you, Rob. So I was going to talk about our chapter. It's co-written with Rachel Eager. And the chapter is looking at the role and the changing role of the evaluator and what that might have in terms of ethical implications. So the broad, very broad working definition was, right or wrong behavior, or good and bad behavior of evaluators. And of course, behavior matters in relation to someone else. And so someone else is often respondent in classical ethics kind of realms, but also relationships in terms of other stakeholders and what that means. So the behavior of evaluators. And we use kind of a typology, and there's 3 examples in the chapter, which are, as any typology, life's more complex, but they try and make a point about something. So we talk about, firstly, an external evaluator role, and that's based on a piece of work I did, evaluation of the Millennium Villages in Ghana, which is very much in the mold of independent, external, evidence-based evaluation, very much on accountability focus. And the focus there was on assessing impact. In the middle, an example of a program on adolescents working across several countries in Africa, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Tanzania. And there it had some of those elements. So there was a baseline endpoint with and without assessment of outcomes and effects and impacts, but also the evaluation accompanied program. So there was a learning role in terms of feeding in and helping the program to adapt and change. And there the focus is both on assessing impact, but also improving impact. So the role had changed. And the last example is based on a piece of work over several years in Nigeria, working with an empowerment program. And the evaluator was embedded within the program. So no longer really about assessing impact, but much more about facilitating the process, the evaluative process and the learning process, and being part of that, and very much embedded within that. I guess it's important because we're seeing increasingly kind of a shift more to some of the middle and the right-hand side in terms of embedded evaluator, where in this world where there's a greater realization amongst program commissioners and evaluation commissioners that it's complex and things keep changing, and you need to think about the system, where you fit in the system, and how you relate to emergent properties and how you adapt to course correct. And so feedback and learning evidence, it changes in that context. Also, we see evaluation much more thinking about how evaluation can be used as a tool to promote equity, so the relationships and how that's important. So we see a shift, and I guess we characterize the book a bit of a shift from purely assessing impact and evaluation of impact to becoming much more about achieving impact. So you're partly, you could say, co-opted, but partly you're part of that process of trying to do good, trying to cause change, trying to make things better. You're not separate and isolated from that. And so for us, we were exploring how those different roles and different demands make a change in what we think about some of the more traditional ethical behaviors. Things are like around it, independence and transparency, about what do no harm means and what doing good might be. And so I'm just going to take you through a couple of examples. So the first one is really about independence. Whereas in the external evaluator role, there was a lot of governance, quite elaborate governance arrangements that were about protecting, most of the time, the evaluator. So we had a body which put all the traditional stakeholders that had an interest in the success of the program were able to give advice and an advisory function, but not able to approve what we did. So their power was limited. And then we put more of the approval function in a technical group that was supported by 3IE that had the right to approve what we were doing. And they focused just on methodology, quality of the findings, credibility, transparency of findings. So we kind of split it that way, which is unusual, but it gave us a governance structure that allowed us to navigate the ethics and the often pressure you might get to change findings, alter findings, nuance in a different way was kind of governed that way. There was, of course, other mechanisms like the traditional ethical review boards we had in America and Ghana, we went through, which govern the relationships between us and respondents, and made sure there was protection. And when we're working with children with vulnerable groups, thinking about how those process. And there was other protocols in that whole evaluation about governing when things could be escalated, when you would overstep a line. And so very much about governing all those relationships, ensuring things like independence, protection of the vulnerable. But when it kind of very much in that tradition of do no harm, and that's the kind of ethical realm, very much kind of from a long history in research where that kind of grew out. So relatively speaking, quite familiar, and familiar, as Rob said, in a lot of the guidance, that's where a lot of the focus is. As we kind of moved into these other areas, you begin to raise questions like, so I'm going to cover a couple: independence and transparency as ethical principles. So the ethical principles of independence, in that middle and increasingly it became less relevant at the end, you couldn't have independence the same way because you were part of the program. You were part of management, you were part of those feeding those decisions. So independence became a question for us, and particularly in that middle one, we found different solutions to that. We couldn't say we were purely independent because there wasn't those structures. We were reporting to management. We're actually part of the consulting delivery. So in there, one of the ways we've navigated that, and there's many ways, and this is where kind of practice and trying to fill your way, and there's little guidance, was about thinking less about independence in terms of governance structures, but independence in terms of process. And so we focus a lot on the process that will allow us to be independent in certain spaces, but maybe less independent, in other words, allowing other views and pressures in others. So the example was in the process of evaluation, we allowed much more room and transparency around kind of views of creating the questions themselves. But then in terms of data collection and findings analysis, we kept that very much in, we agreed with everyone that that would be very much independent and in our role, and then brought it back in a sense-making process and co-creation at the end around actually making sense of findings, what do they mean with everyone else. And so instead of being purely separate and independent and protecting ourselves separate, we chose a process and agreed it with everyone, which allowed transparently when we would include voices and when we would exclude voices very deliberately, so that we could have our be separated from pressure to do things a certain way. So that was kind of one of the things we navigated. The other example around transparency and around process was, particularly at the far end when you're embedded, was actually we're finding ourselves in meetings where it became unclear what were we doing in those meetings, because people wanted timely, fast, quick evidence, and that wasn't always compatible with the rigor that they wanted as well. So then you're in meetings and you've got a kudos of being evaluated and evidence-based, but actually often you're being put in positions where you're probably expressing more, I would say, expert opinion, but you might even go as far as just was opinion, based on a few observations of the program while you're there, but not necessarily something that you might say is generalizable in whatever sense, generalized or rigorous, whatever sense of rigorous you might use. So kind of being in meetings and in forums, being pulled in where you're asked to provide evidence and you're feeling an ethical dilemma that are you actually providing some sort of expertise, or are you actually providing opinion, and being in quite awkward space in that sense. So that's quite a challenge, and I don't think we've ever quite resolved that. I think one of the ways we try to resolve that is to think much more about the process again, so the rigor of the process, and thinking about particularly in the embedded evaluator, the process being handed over much more to others who would think about evidence, collect evidence, sense-make evidence, and our role more clearly and more transparency was about helping them with thinking about evaluative thinking and critical thinking and weighing up evidence and all the things that we could help with and build capacity in, but we weren't actually doing that ourselves. So being very transparent that we'd handed that over. And I guess we end the chapter trying to extend that a bit further, because it felt like the ethical dilemma was all in the evaluation space. We were the ones worrying about it all the time. And the program didn't seem to worry about that, well, so much. I mean, obviously there are guidance and operational manuals and stuff, but it seemed like we were the ones being reflective and thinking about the dilemmas, and less so in the program. And I think we felt a sense in which there's a way to go, but thinking about process instead of just being about evaluation process, but decision-making process, and thinking about actually the quality and transparency of those processes and what counts as evidence, what counts as different voices, when should you include, exclude, what's right and wrong, and what are the judgments and how those made, what's good and bad, much more broadly from the decision-making point of view rather than just the evaluation process point of view. So that's kind of where we ended up helping to an extent in this last situation, the teams think about those things, about the processes themselves and how they capture learning, how they weigh up learning, what evidence meant, when it was at different strengths of evidence, when it was rigorous and what they meant by rigorous. And so our role was much more about the providing transparency rather than independence. So that's kind of how we navigated that. I wouldn't ever say there's something to be cracked there, but I guess we were sharing this chapter, some of those experiences, and wanting to enter a conversation with the other authors of the book, and hopefully, as a consequence of the book, some of those conversations about how others are dealing with those dilemmas. So,
Thanks very much, Chris. Excellent. Really nice to get the kind of your examples there from your experiences. So Penny, over to you.
Going to be the other one, right?
Yes, ideally it's.
Normally, I don't like being here. I like being here.
You can still be seen. You can walk out a little ways. You
Can I
stand
be
all the
here?
way back there.
Yeah. We'll go. Let's see. You can go
Okay,
online.
let's see if they can.
Yeah.
Pop you a.
Well, is it not what's behind us, not what they're seeing?
No, it's the hearing.
Oh, it's the hearing.
Give it a go, Penny.
Okay, so I don't have any slides, because one of the reasons for doing the book, as Rob said, is that what we hope for is that the book stimulates conversations and discussion, so that people really get their teeth into it. Like we're able to talk about ethics and learn from each other and move the field forward. So that's the general idea. So I'm going to keep what I'm saying fairly short. I've said that before and gone on for a long time. Try and keep it short. But I'm really interested in what everybody in the room thinks and whether we can have a sort of rich discussion about all of this, and indeed people online. So I think the book was published last December, I think. Did it take us about 3 years or more? Took a while. So any of you who think of producing books, it's not a quick, easy thing. I think the book raised some really important issues, and I would encourage you obviously to read the book, goes without saying. But it couldn't cover everything, right? So it was reliant on authors like Chris coming forward, sharing their learning, sharing their experience, and as well as what we hope for, provoking discussion. So the further discussion. Now, I like the 3 things Rob said at the beginning, that what we found from talking to the evaluation profession and a few others is that there's this range of views about the relationship between ethics and evaluation. So either it doesn't apply, it's not relevant, or I've never done it. But that to me was quite surprising, because if you look into the professional associations around the world of evaluation, although there's not a lot of ethics guidance, there is some fairly significant and useful ethical guidance. So American Evaluation Association, Australasian, or it's now the Australian Evaluation, and European, whoever, UK one. They're not silent on ethics, so you can find ethical guidance out there. And Rob also talked about a global effort, because evaluation is global and it's kind of spread around the world. So most of the focus of ethics is on this notion of professional practice, so the professionalization of evaluation, and including ethics in that. But as the book couldn't cover everything, the evaluation profession doesn't cover everything. Okay, so if you're thinking of becoming or already are involved in evaluation, you very quickly get sucked into an association, no doubt. And these groupings are useful because it gives you a community of practice, a peer group, and as I said, gives some guidance. However, one of the questions that I have about the issues around ethics is ethics relating to evaluation. Is the field keeping up with what's happening in the world? Okay, and Chris's presentation really talked about some of the changes that have happened and still continue to happen. So one of my concerns, I guess, is that as I've expanded the kind of areas of work that I've done since leaving being involved within an organisation, I've sort of come across evaluation in different forms in different places, in different fields, sectors, organisations. So it isn't one thing. Even in international development evaluation, it's not one thing. So that kind of caused me to think, okay, so if it's taking on these different forms with different groups of people in different places at different times, how do we actually, how do we get the global effort going, focusing on ethics? How do we reach out to these different groups? If we identify as evaluators, there are other people doing evaluation who don't identify as professional evaluators. So that to me kind of means that these further discussions have to be more wide-ranging than I thought in the beginning when I first got involved in doing the book. So who are those global players? Right, because we all work in a somewhat siloed way, really. So we find our group and we work within that, and that's our world. We don't often look beyond the boundaries of that world and see what else is going on. And this what I would characterize, and perhaps provocatively, an introspective focus on professionalization causes you to look inwards rather than outwards. Some would argue with me, but that's my view. So in this broader context, other players are taking responsibility for impact measurements, process evaluation, the kinds of work that we do as we identify as evaluators. And for the last 5 years or so, I've moved into working in the impact investment field. Now, who's familiar with impact? Is that a term that you've heard? Yes? Okay, great. Yes. So the astounding thing about impact investment is that it hasn't been going very long, and because I'm involved in that world now, I get newsletters and things. Last week, it was announced that the amount of money has now reached $1 trillion American dollars. So you've got this world which is expanding, and they're moving into international development, investing purposefully to achieve impact, do good in the world. That's the idea. That's the intent. You can argue whether or not that's happening, but that's the intent. So this is all going on, and yet when I move back into the evaluation world, we're still talking to ourselves. We're still talking about, conventional orthodox evaluation circles. So to me, that's a concern. There are more evaluators being, if you take the Venn diagram, so you've got the kind of development assistance that's focused on that evaluation happens there, and then you've got impact investing, and there is some overlap. There are some experienced evaluators moving into that sector and working, but it's still two camps, two tribes, if you like, so two different groups of people. So it's happening in parallel, and at a time when government investments are decreasing. The traditional official development assistance would be an example of that, right? So you see budget cuts in DFID. DFID is not the only development organisation that's had budget cuts. Money's getting tight in government. So at the time, when that's contracting, we've got this other commercial, more commercially oriented, market-driven investment field, which is getting bigger. Now, I was at Oxford a couple of weeks ago teaching on a course for impact investors, and I decided to talk to them about ethics. It was a risk, but I decided to do it anyway. So I just had a show of hands. There were 42 people in the room, and said, who's thought about ethics in their work, in either in impact investment or in impact measurement as part of impact assessment? There were 2 people out of 42 people that had even had a fleeting thought about ethics. So, I mean, that's not a scientific survey or anything, but that was surprising to me. So it has not even occurred to them, as it has to some evaluators, that ethics is any kind of relevance or is worth talking about. So that's intriguing because there are a lot of there's a lot of critique around impact investing and the integrity of the information that comes out. Right. So if you pick up an impact report from an impact investing fund, it purports to measured and reported on impact, but from an evaluation perspective, at least from a technical perspective, it wouldn't be recognizable as what we would consider to be impact. It's probably a sort of output level. It's just really talking about what they're doing rather than how the world is changing because of the investment. So, so that integrity issue of those reports has been challenged, and the notion of impact washing. Mm-hmm. So claiming impact without actually properly gathering evidence and being able to say something about impact. So in a way, I see integrity as a sort of sub component of ethics. So already, before it's even got going in any serious measurement of impact, kind of fallen at first fence, right? So I think the questions for me are, okay, if we're going to have a global effort, who are we going to focus on? Is it all those players, old players, new players, you know, or is it that we focus on our own community and our own profession that we identify with and get that right, and then try and sell it to the others? I don't have answers to these questions, but I think given that impact investing has reached 1 trillion, it's going to be affecting a lot of people's lives. And what can we do about that? I might leave it there.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Thanks very much to all of you and Penny for those provocations at the end. Maybe just to get us moving on the discussion before we turn to some of the questions I see that have been coming in online. So it strikes me that so Rob, going back to your point of one of the conclusions in the book is around this effort to harmonize guidelines and language so that at least we can have a conversation across them. Yeah. But yet we know that all of the work on all of these guidelines hasn't necessarily translated into change in the tackling bad and doing good, right? So that I guess is an assumption there that perhaps guidelines aren't the only piece of the puzzle, right? And to your point, Penny, that now it's actually a much broader community, right? And Chris, to your points about the sort of navigating that day-to-day reality of actually thinking and working ethically, right? So the kind of embodied practice that I think we've been calling for some years. So what, in your experience, do you think needs to happen alongside the conversation about guidelines? Yeah. Because the missing piece of supporting, and these are discussions that we've had in ethics, in social science research. For example, the Society of Ethnobiology had this really interesting process where they engaged with ethics in a way that was intending to support people as the conflicts arrived, right? So that sort of enabling you to navigate in practice. So what might that look like for evaluation? How do we fill that space alongside the guidelines, improving, etc., from your experience and from across the chapters in the book?
If I may start on your first question of what kind of discussion are we imagining about all of this that would be that would lead to better insight, but not be lead to a new dictatum of how things should be done. In fact, one of the last points I made is that if, as evaluators, we need to look at the context of the activities that we are evaluating in order to be able to identify whether things are going bad or things are going in the right direction, in order to do that, in the book we write, evaluators should apply heuristics, which is basically a quick search approach where you go through a wide range of issues and see whether these issues are relevant or not relevant. And that will help you identify, oh, potentially there's something in agricultural development that's going wrong in this country, or that is actually going very well. It could be an example for others. So this kind of heuristical approach is something that we advocate at the end. And then I find that in psychology, actually, heuristics has a very bad name. You should not apply heuristics. Heuristics is fast thinking, which is based on all kinds of prejudices, and it's based on quick thinking that is, so Daniel Kahneman and his group of people say, heuristics, you shouldn't do heuristics. Please be a bit thorough in your approach. But actually, they use heuristics in a different way than we use it. And I'm not saying that one of these ways is good and the other is bad. I'm just saying, let's know what we are talking about. Let us have a discussion where we say, oh yes, and maybe even you identify, I need to find a different term for this, because half of the university doesn't understand what I'm talking about, or half of the evaluation community doesn't understand what I'm talking about, and we need to prevent that from happening. So the discussion, in my view, would just also be, can we get more clarity on what we mean by these terms, and when they would be applied?
Thanks, Rod. Any thoughts, Chris and Penny?
I think, yeah, the guidance. I think it's less about guidance, more about the language, finding the language that allows us to have the conversations is really important, because like Penny was saying, there's different groups, very different groups, and if you're not able to even talk about the same thing, that's very difficult, because ethics, even when I talk within our organisation, it has very varied impact to people's understanding and being able to talk through the issues. So I think less guidance, but more about language and conversations. I guess the other bit was really about incentives, and I think there is a role, and whether that's professional bodies or whether that's commissioners or whoever, to actually kind of create some of these incentives. So there is kind of commissioners mention ethics, but they don't put much emphasis on it when they award contracts, for instance, or when they assess the end result. It is reviewed, but it's reviewed in a very narrow sense in terms of the do no harm aspects. So I think it's clarity there that there's a stronger requirement to include it. And there's obviously different bodies that could do that. The impact investing would it.
That was actually just what I was going to say.
Oh, sorry.
Because I was going to say, okay, it's guidance, that's what guidance is, you like, but people aren't necessarily going to be using guidance. It's good to have, because you can have a discussion about it. So I was thinking expectations, which is probably similar to your incentives. So if there's an expectation, which probably needs to come from, whoever's wanting evaluation to be done, commissioners or communities or whoever it is, what are the expectations of evaluation practice, and the ethical considerations? And I think at the moment that there's a bit of a shift around an understanding or a realization that evaluation isn't this, as Rob said, isn't this kind of neutral technical exercise. It's an intervention. The minute you ask somebody a question, something happens. The minute you go into community and say, we're going to evaluate this thing, something happens. So evaluation changes things from the beginning, from the minute it's thought of, things start to change. And there's an ethical dimension to that, as well as looking at ethics through an evaluation lens. So I think guidelines can get you so far, but guidelines don't provide answers about what to do in particular situations or different contexts. So I think yes, guidance, but realise the limitations.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, it links your expectation point, links a bit to Chris, what you were talking about in terms of transparency. If you're an embedded evaluator, you're accepting that you're part of the messy system. So you've moved away from pretending that you don't have any influence on it, and you're accepting that you do. Therefore, transparency and clarifying those expectations is kind of the beginning of the journey. Great. Let's see. We've got a few people online. I think I saw a question from Stephen Porter. Did you want to unmute and ask your question and maybe share even any of your own thoughts on your question?
Yep. Hi there. I'll also switch on my camera so I can sort of be a little bit in the room as well. Hi. So Stephen Porter, I'm an evaluator with the Independent Evaluation Group at the World Bank. So the question I was asking was, where are you in your own journey in adapting your practices based upon ethics? Maybe just to sort of share a little bit about some of the things we're thinking about in the IEG, or starting to work on indeed. So in adapting our own practice, I think we're looking at our sort of positionalities is something that we're very aware of. That on the one hand, IEG, World Bank has a reputation and certain constraints around that how we can enter a conversation. We hold a great deal of power, but with that power comes a certain history of being an institution set up in the Second World War, mainly driven by what would be discussed as colonial powers. So that's something that we definitely bring into the conversation. I think that means that when we talk about ethics, and what we're now starting to talk about more as responsible evaluation practices, we've kind of got to be more in listening mode. We're not necessarily the right actor to be able to lead conversations. We need to be able to start listening to people who are talking about indigenization, decolonisation, equity and evaluation, because these aren't part of our lexicon, and we're not necessarily at the front line and the activism of these debates. So I think that's we sort of acknowledge our deficiencies in being able to talk in these spaces and try to start to work in more listening mode. In terms of our own changes, I think, and this sort of builds upon what the panel was saying, I think we're trying to, rather than talk about ethics, which can be a little bit maybe abstract, is try to focus upon what's the practical changes we need to make. And we've, as I said, focus more on this term of sort of responsible evaluation, to be able to say, well, if we want to be good professionals and responsible about the way that we work, what's the changes? What's the sort of one behavior that we can change in the way that we do things? Is it on our data collection? Is it the way that we approach safeguards? Is it that we need to sort of look at the bias that we have inherent in the way that we operate in evaluation? And so in doing that, and sort of maybe trying to move away a little bit, I mean, guidance is important because you need a sort of framing document, you need principles. But there's a lot of principles out there, and I think the question is how you do bring those into your organization in a way that makes sense. And another point I think we're trying to think upon is that sort of internal and external co-design process. How can we have an open process that allows people to enter the conversation with where they're at? As Penny and Rob said, that people may not identify themselves as, nobody wants to think of themselves as an irresponsible evaluator. But at the same time, we do exercise power actively. We do set agendas, and we have unconscious biases that we bring into the way that we talk about our work and that we make judgments on issues. So in working through with people where they are in those conversations, people are starting from different points. So by having a more open co-design process, it allows people to sort of come in and have discussions, say, I don't really get this, but maybe there's something interesting I can look at. And I think resonating with what Penny said, there's a lot, we need to sort of look at the innovations that are happening outside what may have been the core of evaluation. And I think that's part of what we're trying to do as well. So just to acknowledge colleagues, Josephine Watera and Miller von Rucho also on the call, is that Josephine sort of bringing in sort of this work that she's been undertaking through Uganda with parliaments in Africa, with ideas on how to rethink evaluation standards, whereas Miller comes from a sort of design anthropologist background with how do we bring in the sort of human element, how do we work with different communities and sort of bring in different voices around how we work. So I think that's sort of our journey on this, is reflecting upon our own positionality, making sure that we're aware of what we can and can't do, try to be wide ranging, bring in different voices, a lot of listening, and trying to mobilize internally, starting from where people are at, and try to keep it practical, because then people can say, well, what's the change I need to make, and what does that look like? So that's our journey, and it'd be great to hear where co-attendees, authors of the book are in their own. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Stephen. I love the emphasis on the practical, which partly answers the previous question too. You know, moving alongside guidance and guidelines, actually emphasizing the practical. Did others, you mentioned a couple of colleagues, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you wanted to, Josephine and Miller, I think, did you want to come in and share some of your experience? Or anyone else in the room?
Yeah, I'll talk, but allow me to speak off camera. I'm not sure of my bandwidth is.
We can hear
I
you.
just want to thank, I just want to thank the presenters. Rob, it's nice to see you again. I've worked with Rob to come up with the competence framework for ideas, but also I've been able to work with the Uganda Evaluation Association to develop the ethical standards for evaluation in Uganda. And I've also supported the American Evaluation Association in their review of the evaluation principles and guidelines, and then led also the process of development of the Africa evaluation principles that transited from the African evaluation guidelines. So I am so glad to be here and to listen to these debates. And emphasis on ethics cannot be underestimated, especially as we go into this era of leave no one behind, and also nothing for us without us. It's important that aspects of ethics are put into consideration. We are working in an environment where there's a lot of social media, and they quickly pick up things that have gone wrong. So as evaluators, we need to be sensitive that if something went wrong now, it can make rounds faster than good things that have happened in our brackets. So I just want to appreciate once again the efforts and the discussions that are on the floor, and I look forward to engage more and learn more. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Josephine. Mila.
Hi, I turned my camera. I'm in Buenos Aires. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Stephen, for introducing us. I resonate with what you were saying, with what the presenters were saying, especially when you were talking about values, like how we bring values to our practices. That's something we want to explore in our open process. So just looking forward to hear what other colleagues have to say about that too. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mila. Thanks for joining. Great. I wonder if I would pick up on the point that Josephine was making there, which is this piece around the tackling bad, right, in your framework. So you talked about how there isn't quite as much guidance on it, and maybe that's because it's quite hard to know how you do it, right? There's one thing to think about the ways in which we do good. It's quite a different thing to grapple with what it means to actually tackle bad, and the extent to which that the role of the evaluator then is very much beyond perhaps what many people's comfort zone is, which is the sort of technical professional bit. So I wondered if you could say a bit more about that, if you had further any of these thoughts about how that tackling bad piece of the puzzle works.
Well, we actually have 2 chapters in the book about evaluating in difficult situations, in fragile countries, in conflict situations, and on resettlement issues. And these chapters describe the difficulties that evaluators encounter when they need to evaluate a local intervention that either saves people or supports people in very difficult circumstances. And so the book has quite a number of examples And several of these examples basically focus on doing no harm, because there is you are endangering people in a local situation, for example, in a conflict situation, by helping them. And so the first step that they more or less have is still the do no harm perspective. And it's in their case, it's even more important, because the harm can be horrendous. And the conflict can suddenly move into an area where the intervention has been active. So these are indeed very difficult ethical questions, and they are not simply easily solvable, that you can say, oh, well, it's very clear that you can move in this direction and it will be okay. And there is also another element there, that the expectations from the people that you reach out to in an evaluation, in a situation of that is really very difficult, conflictuous, that basically you can sorry, let me rephrase this. I could not get this formulation correct. So basically the situation is that the people that you are interacting with almost immediately start developing their own expectations about the intervention. And there are all kinds of horrible consequences of that. So basically, you as an evaluator come there and say, how could we potentially help you? And they say, well, you can defend us against these aggressors, but you have, as an evaluator, you have no way to defend them against these aggressors. And so at a certain moment you say, so sorry, we cannot help you on this specific issue. And they say, but we've already burned our bridges and we are now depending on you. You will need to help us. So you get into processes that can be irreversible. And this is all ethically very difficult and not easy to solve. And as a result, the community that is working in fragile situations, conflictuous situations, tends to focus even more on do no harm than because they already doing no harm is very difficult.
Yeah. Are there, sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say on the tackling bad thing, I think from an ethical perspective, I think what this requires in practice is to think this through up front, right? And an example would be, drawing on an example that I was involved in quite a long time ago, but it was around rehabilitation of criminal offenders. I won't go into any detail, but the evaluation was to look at the effectiveness of the rehabilitation intervention. Now, with that, what we did for that, because we thought, what do we do if our interviews with men, it was, what do we do if our interviews with these men throws up the fact that they're continuing to offend and people are getting harmed? So what we decided to do was develop a protocol that we could follow if we found bad things were happening as part of our evaluation. So we know who to go to, well, first of all, what decision to make, who to go to, etc. Just so that we felt we weren't surprised by this and we didn't, it would have made it more difficult. So that was actually starting with a guide, with an ethical guideline, but taking it further and saying, okay, what if this happens, then we will need to do this, this, and this. But also from an ethical perspective of interacting with the offenders, you'd also, where we realised we also had to tell them that this is what we would do in that situation, for full disclosure and informed consent. So it got a bit complicated, but I guess it was the best that we could think up at that point in time. But we had to think of it before we started the evaluation.
It's sort of, it reminds me a lot of the discussions around safeguard.
Yeah,
And the way that,
exactly.
the way that is.
Yeah. Yeah, that's related to that. Yeah.
Anybody in the room?
Yeah.
Have yes, please.
Sorry, this is regarding, I mean, are there any sectors or domains or organizations which have a mature evaluation process in terms of not just meeting the do no harm criteria, but also incorporating the other two elements, which is tackling bad and doing good? And if yes, if there is a particular domain or a sector or an organization which is able to sort of incorporate all this, why is it that that particular organization or sector has been able to do this? Are there any fundamental reasons why this happens? Is it because of the investment? Is it because of the risk to the respondents, for example? Or is there an inverse correlation? Because I mean, for example, when you're testing drugs, I mean, ethics becomes really important because there are lives involved. But we've also seen that that's one area where ethically, I mean, it's challenged as well. So, but any examples of domains or sectors?
I mean, yeah, I think a number of different sectors. I think, just as a general response to the question, I think it's mistakes that have been made that help us to learn and apply our practice differently. So as you say, in the health sector, you know that bad things have been done in the name of evaluation or research or whatever, like, trying new drugs on vulnerable communities or whatever, and not taking care of the ethical practice adequately. So I think when things go wrong, we pay more attention to that kind of thing, and then we learn. So I think probably the health sector has learned a lot. I would say the social development sector and the various parts of that have also learned a lot from doing the wrong thing. Maybe environment, Rob, because environment's another where things have gone badly wrong in many cases. So would you, I don't know whether you have anything to say on that.
Yes, if I may add to this, indeed, several of the environmental funds have this kind of practice to look at the as broad a perspective as possible and to include various ethical perspectives. The climate investment funds come to mind, the Global Environment Facility, and various climate funds that are supported by the bilaterals. And they have that perspective because indeed, as Penny says, environment is something that people are involved in, and they have adverse consequences from what is happening directly. Their safeguarding issues are there. So yes, and companies, evaluation companies that move in this area, like ITED, tend to also have this kind of a broader perspective. So you have evaluation companies, consultancy firms that are focusing on efficiency issues and rates of returns and so on. But the kind of company that ITED is has this broader perspective. And I was very glad to hear Josephine Batera in this. She's a member of the board of IDEAS. IDEAS is also a kind of gathering of perspectives that are bottom up and broad and have an ethical guidance that several of our authors in the book have been very active in IDEAS. I don't know why. So there is a kind of, some of these associations are rather top down and others are very interactive and have a broad perspective. So that's also, it's happening throughout the evaluation community, but it's by no means universal.
Great, thanks. Eric, did you want to-
Yeah, I wanted to build on this comment and bring, and I'm also looking behind your heads at comments there that relate to this comment of the health sector, because I come from I work in the space of health research, and two things to sort of raise related to what's being talked about with various people in the room today. One is that the it's come quite far in terms of the ethics protocols and processes one has to undertake, but to such an extent that it, the instrumental nature of the box ticking exercise means that some of the more dynamic questions around process, around power, are left under-examined, in part because the burden of getting through the ethics protocol process focuses so much on also certain assumptions about who's in the position of doing harm that are really, in a way, actually kind of to go back to like earlier, are quite colonial and imperial in nature, that often don't recognize the, the, I don't know, very live dynamics of power that emerge in the context of a health research intervention or program. And so I think that there could be some benefit from actually crossing that boundary, at least between sort of evaluation space and people in health research spaces, particularly those who are doing, let's say, the more like humanistic focused or sort of the social, political spaces of knowledge production in health, but have quite a lot to say about the limitations of sort of where health research ethics guidelines protocols have gotten to. But another thing that's emerging in health research are increasing demands, saying that it's an ethical imperative to be more inclusive of the knowledge generation process. So community engagement and involvement, or as one language is being used, but saying that health research itself is a domain that if it is not more inclusive is in fact unethical or is not sufficiently ethical, because all of this work is being done in the name of alleged beneficiaries isn't in fact done in genuine collaboration with those alleged beneficiaries. But then that approach flies straight in the face of who's an expert and what is expert knowledge. So kind of picking up on various things we've all related to, this idea about sort of where does that leave independence or expertise? I mean, I'm trained in humanities and I'm a historian by nature, so I throw the whole idea that anybody can sit independent like out the window, because if you look at this body of practice and knowledge built over time, you can see how embedded it is within political processes at any given moment in time. But I think that that's what can make people very uncomfortable. So I think oftentimes you have people retreating into neutrality, technical neutrality, because they talk about anything else is like really flies in the face of their identity and their practice. And these raise very difficult questions. So I just threw a bunch of things out, but I think that all of this, maybe in health field, there's been more work to, I was shocked actually by the very first presentation, you said a third of people didn't think ethics applied to them at all, because in health, I think like the demands are, you do have to go through that process to undertake research. So that part people understand they have to do, but the extent to which they really do it, or do the sort of critical reflexivity, or, are attentive to the dynamics of power, is, I would say that probably looks more like your third breakdown in terms of who's actually working in that more rigorous way, if you want to use that language. But they're good questions to ask, but I think there's quite a lot of work that needs to be done. And actually, sorry, the one question I had, or a question that's raised for me, I don't think you can answer it. The question that's raised for me is when we talk about any of this, and about the idea of having something that's shared or common, I wonder if that's the right direction to take, because what is seen as doing no harm or doing good or avoiding bad is going to look so distinct, depending on that sort of context-specific nature of the action that's undertaken. So I do wonder that sometimes, because I think a flaw of development is that it can an action and processes, and certainly global health, is people can hide behind the notion that they are doing work in a field that is doing good, and that in and of itself can create barriers to opening up the kind of conversations you're seeking to have people having, where they can actually acknowledge that there is unintended and intended negative consequences of this field of practice. Sorry, that was not really a question. It's a lot of ideas.
Great comments, Erica. Well, given the time, what I think we'll do is take, if there are any other thoughts in the room, and then we'll have a look at the chat, and then I'll give you guys a last chance to maybe reflect on any of the many points that have been raised. Gil, did you want to?
A short question, but a bit linked to the thing that Erica said about ethical procedures in medicine. If you go to the impact investment space, where we're both, Penny and Chris, are working in, perhaps you can learn, evaluators are generally a bit ex post, but ex ante in the impact investment space, the due diligence is a big thing, and it's very developed, and is something perhaps which provides an entry point for for incorporating those type of ethical considerations structurally in how people make decisions before something bad happens, and you, as an evaluator, are there only too late.
Sure. Shall we respond to those and then we'll have a look at the chat?
Okay, just before I forget, your point about due diligence. Yes, I mean, I think what's sort of happening in that impact investing field, as I see it, is that the financial side is worked out really well. So due diligence kind of comes from that business world, you know. So the due diligence on the financial side already has a way of doing it. What's slowly happening, probably much more slowly than most people would want, is that sort of due diligence type approach where you're kind of very carefully looking through the intent of the investment. Also on the impact side, the same kind of process, but it's not, I think it's fair to say it's not fully developed yet. But the aim that most people would want to see working in that field is when you've got equivalence on the financial side as well as the impact side, whether that impact is social, environmental, or whatever. So yes, exactly. I think it's starting to happen, but it's not fully developed yet.
Great. I mean, I think the point about transparency from the beginning is come across, right? And that's an example in that space where it can be helpful. Graham, you made a couple of points and you asked a great question about the thorniest ethical dilemma. Did you want to unmute and ask your question? Graham LePage?
Sure thing. Good to see you all. I'm calling in from Australia. So it's the middle of the night here. Yeah, I just was curious about what the thorniest ethical dilemma was that you all encountered in this space. Where, when it's not clear about, there's not a simple way out.
Great, thanks. Can we have the chat up again? We'll take any hits before we give. Peter Ton, did you want to share your question about the focus areas of the book?
Thank you for giving me the word. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. I just had a question about the book and the content. As a practitioner in evaluations, as I write down in the question, there are relations with the beneficiaries to be taken into account, or the target groups, intended beneficiaries, relations with stakeholders along the project chain, so to say. There are issues about ethics in the process of the evaluation and feeding back the results, outcomes. And there are contractual relations which relate to the independence of the evaluator. And I just wondered whether all these 4 elements figure in the book before I buy it. Which is, thank you.
Great question. Thanks very much, Peter. Okay, so why don't it would be great to have a few thoughts from each of you on those questions or anything else that came up. Don't feel you need to answer everything, but anything you'd like to share as final words.
Where would you want to start?
Okay, yeah. So I guess final questions to me. I think for me, I feel in this process doing the book and other bits of work, it's kind of expanded my mind of what ethics covers, and perhaps scarily so in some ways. But I think for me more personally, it's kind of highlighted things of positionality, kind of my role and influence on others, on how we work in partnerships. So we're experimenting now with partnerships in our consultancy work where we're not leading, but we've got others in Nigeria, say, who are leading the contract, which creates a space deliberately that's very awkward and very difficult and creates conversations that are hard to navigate and conversations with clients as well about all sorts of things that you wouldn't kind of imagine that come up. So I think for me, it's kind of pushing the boundaries a bit of the comfort zone and putting yourself in positions where you're having to have those conversations. I guess the other space for me is I do some work in data analytics and using artificial intelligence, machine learning, and the ethical dilemmas are there are quite huge and quite undeveloped in relation to the evaluation work and things of where you're scraping data from, whose data, the biases within that data, how that data is used, the black box of actually covering a lot of things and will give the answer and you cannot pick that. And there's huge issues in that, which is a space I'm trying to open up a little bit more. It's quite challenging. So those two are kind of areas in terms of journey and where I'm
Thanks very much.
Overall, I think one of the things that's that I've come to realise, and I don't know how much it's shared, but ethics at this moment in time seems more discussable. So, you know, given the broader things that are happening in society, given the international situation, political landscape, etc., it seems like now is the time because we're facing a lot of moral issues in our world and how we can get past that, how we can improve things. So I think now's a good time to raise these issues, and for us, because if we're focusing on the work that we do, then applying those sort of broader thoughts about ethics, what it means to us in our work. How does that motivate us to work in certain ways, direct our energies onto certain things in the time that we live in now? So a very sort of broad answer. Yeah.
Yes, well, one of the online questions was on the thorniest dilemma. And if we want the book to achieve anything, it is that evaluators should increasingly concern themselves about the thorniest dilemma of the stakeholders, of the people on the ground, not so much the thorniest dilemma of the evaluator. Evaluators are relatively rich, they don't go into conflict situations, they are relatively safe, but it's the people on the ground who really have great difficulties. And I haven't, it requires then to look broader than your, this is the challenge that the book poses. It requires to look beyond the immediate concerns of the evaluation. So I noticed at a certain moment that there was an evaluation in India on a tea plantation that wanted to have an environmental stamp of approval. And an evaluation team went in and would basically say, yes, the stamp of approval can be given, or no, you need to update your and what is the criticism from an ethical perspective on this? That if you do this as a purely technical exercise, you will end up with a green stamp on the production or not. But let's say you do. But actually in India, labor in tea plantations is a huge social issue. There are many areas in India where the labor is being exploited in tea plantations. This is not unknown. There are many Indian NGOs that are active on this, that are trying to do something about this. So how can you go into a situation like that and just look at the green stamp and not look at what people are experiencing there? So this is, for me, an important issue about this broadening of the perspective. And the last issue, Peter raised whether all issues are tackled in his terminology. But I think we do, but not really necessarily in your terminology. So, but it's we go through the full range in the book. Thank you.
Good. Okay, well, thanks very much. We're at time, and thanks everybody online for staying with us. Yeah, I mean, I think those final comments on it's a moment for us to be talking about these things. We talk also about decolonising. It's a moment in which we can discuss these in ways that we couldn't before. So I think the book is helping to open up those conversations in more sort of concrete ways. I think the ideas of thinking about other sectors, impact investing or machine learning, that maybe there are areas where the conversation is just starting. So how do we bring all this learning from what has and hasn't worked in our other spaces into those, and how do we connect things up? I think that's also really exciting. And yeah, the idea of focusing perhaps also on practice and behavior, and sometimes just getting it down to that level as an entry point to actually thinking about moving things forward. So thank you everybody online. Thanks so much to our speakers, our panel, especially because you've come from very far. So it's a great privilege to have you here with us. And thanks everybody in the room. And we'll be sending the slides out and contact details if you guys are happy to everybody. I think there's 200 people signed up. So
200.
I think we had about 50 or so joined.
With 48 or something.
Yeah, 48 joined.